Okay. I'm going to be giving this talk about emotional regulation. And as a parent of 3 children, I know the importance of emotional well-being and dealing with anxiety. So for the next 30 minutes, you to develop your your understanding of your child's emotional needs better. And hopefully you'll be able to take away some practical key strategies that you'll be able to use. Okay, so what are the aims for today's session? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what to expect in terms of your child's emotional needs and the impact of COVID. I'm going to talk about how you can best manage this transition of going back to school. And then a little bit about emotional needs and anxiety and what happens to the brain and body when we're stressed. And then some strategies, how you can manage this, how you can manage needs and anxiety and regulate emotions. Okay, so the impact of COVID. So the situation of COVID, I think, and we've already heard from a couple of parents, that people's experience has been very different for everyone. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there will be losses for individuals and families as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And some families will have experienced trauma of bereavement and many different stressors. Other families may have had some positive experiences. But I think for some children, the loss of routine, structure, social interaction, opportunity, and freedom may have created some anxiety and stress. I think also the impact of COVID has the message from society around us has been danger. And essentially, anxiety occurs in a wider context. So this message of danger and experience of weeks or months of social distancing for some children may have developed a feeling of anxiety and that the world and others around them are dangerous. However, I think it's important to say that children and young people are naturally resilient. Their brains are neuroplastic, which means that they're changed and they're able to recover, bounce back from stress. So I think it's really important to remember this when we're thinking about our children, particularly if we're worrying about whether they're going to be in term. I think also to note that even if your child has experienced a particularly stressful time, that trauma and stress can lead to growth and as a result. Okay, so on to the next slide. Transition back to school. And I know, again, it will be a very different experience for some of you. Some of you, your children will have already been at school. Some of them will be back a couple of days and some will haven't been at school at all. So I think, especially if your child hasn't been back to school at all, the first thing will be preparing them as much as possible for any change that will be happening. So before school starts, discuss what might be different when they return. So it might be about school uniforms, where they sit, hand washing, new school routines, and also obviously school may hopefully will provide some information as well, which you might be able to use. This next point I was going to make was be clear about why it's positive for them to return to school. Even if you're not feeling very positive and you're feeling very worried, I think it's talking to them about the importance of learning and being with other children, the routine and structure of school, which can help them feel safe, and also time away from the family unit to build their skills and confidence. And then it's about making time to talk through their anxieties. So their anxieties might range from worrying about learning, from being separated from their family bubble, and obviously health and catching the virus. But it also might be about worries that we might not think are actually important to them. So it might be leaving their pets, or it might be leaving a soft toy. I know for my youngest child, the main thing he was worried was about leaving Miggy, his soft toy. So we had to prepare him in great detail for that. And that was really helpful for him. For some, it also might be that they're worried about they're going to spend less time on what they've been doing, or less time on screen time. So it's just finding out what their worries are. And in the context, if they're worried about learning, it's reminding you that all children have done different amounts of learning and it will vary, but there will be lots of opportunities to catch up when they start school. And also to maybe discuss and highlight what your child has done that's been new, not necessarily in a learning context, and what they have succeeded in doing. And it might be something like resilience skills, so being brave in a difficult situation. It's also maybe about that you need to normalize worries. So it might be they're worried about separating from a family bubble. So separation anxiety, being away from those who you've had a close attachment to. And just talking through with that and explaining that it will pass. It will be difficult, but it will pass. And then I think it's also put here, manage your expectations. So I think it's about just reminding yourself that children will need time to adapt. It's going to be some they haven't started school, and it's education mode. So I know when I actually sort of first went out for the first time with my family after it took 3 times as long to organise ourselves. So I suppose it's just being aware that children will take more time to get used to getting up early, getting everything ready, and also going to sleep at a reasonable time. And sleep, something I'm going to talk about on the next slide. Some children need to relearn social skills, and they might need to take time to ease anxiety and fear about interacting with others. And some children might need small steps over the next few months to encourage them to meet friends, if that's been something they've been particularly worried about. And finally on this slide, I've just put, be honest about the situation, but reassure that everything is being done to keep them safe. And I think I'd say that's the key message, rather than sort of saying to children, or hiding things from children. I think it's about saying that actually it's okay to say I don't know to them, but actually to sort of say school are going to do everything they can to keep you safe, but reassuring in that way, rather than just saying don't worry, everything's going to be okay, because evidence indicates that actually that doesn't help anxiety in the long run. So it's being quite specific if you're going to reassure. Okay. So I've got a slide here on sleep, because I think that probably quite a few parents, I know I found that my children are going to bed later and getting up later in the morning. And I've put a few key tips on how to shift the sleep pattern if that's a difficulty at the moment. So the sleep hormone melatonin is released in the morning, but more so during the evening. And I put no screens an hour before bed. Blue lights from stops the release of melatonin. So that's the first thing to help to make sure that there are no screens. And if you've got an older child, to try and remove the phone from the bedroom at least as well. Other things that help the release of melatonin are exposure to daylight, and also low lights and bath. All those things help the release. Put bedtime routine for all ages. The bedtime routine is really important because it actually gets us into a relaxed state, ready for bed. But ideally, don't make it more than 45 minutes because that relaxed state can't be maintained after that time. So for younger children, it might be bath, story, and for older children, it might be bath, shower, reading, or listening to music. So I've put, don't suddenly change the bedtime. So if your child is going to bed very late and getting up late, if you suddenly change it, it's very difficult for our internal body clock to adjust to that. So we have this internal body clock, which is affected by light, timings, meal times. So if you want to change the bedtime, what you need to do is ideally gradually move it back 15 minutes every 3 days until you get to the desired time, whilst keeping the waking time slightly earlier but the same. And ideally, you want to move towards regular timings of your child's bedtime and getting up the same, or at least within an hour at the week and the weekends, which I appreciate is very difficult if you've got a teenager. Other things which can help sleep are regular meals, and also exercise has been known. Evidence shows that actually this helps sleep, but if it's done too near to bedtime, it can have the opposite effect. So just be aware of that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about understanding anxiety, because I thought it was written in the context that a lot of parents be feeling worried about how their children might be feeling very worried at the moment. How can you manage that? So there are typical steps of anxiety within age groups, And so, and I think, sorry, before I go on to that, it's probably important to say that some anxiety is common, normal, and healthy, and all children experience anxiety as part of normal development. But just returning to the typical stages. So just to give you some of the anxiety within the age groups. So infants, it might be fear of loud noises, being startled, and later fear of strangers. You've got toddlers, it might be they're worried about creatures, fear of the dark, separation anxiety. And school-age children, injury and natural events like storms, and some separation anxiety and friends. And then for older children, it's more performance and typically peer relations, health issues, how they look. So there's just some examples. Anxiety often manifests itself physical symptoms in children. And I think that their bodies talk for them when they can't talk. And they don't often make the connection between the mind and the body. And I'll talk a little bit later about how we can help them to do that. So why do some children worry more than others? You might find that you've got more than one child and that one of your children worries a great deal and the other child doesn't worry at all. So evidence indicates that a third is genetic and that 2/3 is environmental. So it's from the experiences they have, how the adults react around them, from observing others, and also from having limited opportunities. So what I mean by that is if they're worried about going back to school, they may avoid going to school and they don't develop the skills to cope with that. And they also don't develop the ability to tolerate a small amount of anxiety. Okay, a little bit about what happens in the brain and body when we're anxious and stressed. So you can see here with the picture of the brain, the amygdala, which is the green almond-shaped part, and that specifically relates to anxiety and keeps us safe when we're in danger. And the downstairs brain, which is often referred to as the primitive brain or the reptile brain, is the brainstem and the limbic region surrounding that. And that allows us to act before we think and make split survival decisions. The upstairs brain, or the mammal brain, is more sophisticated and is essentially leads us towards connection and relationships, and it allows us to think before we act. So it's the reasoning brain, essentially. So when we feel stressed or angry or worried, the upstairs brain doesn't work properly and we can't think rationally. And you find this is evident when a child's having a tantrum and you try and reason with them, upstairs brain is not working properly and they can't access it, and that's why. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems are also relevant to anxiety. So the sympathetic nervous system helps us deal with stress situations by triggering a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And after the danger has passed, the parasympathetic nervous system decreases our heartbeat and relaxes our blood vessels to reset our system. The vagus nerve also runs from the brain to the body and affects all our organs and slows the system down and also returns the system to normal. So our stress response comes from our primal survival instincts. So when humans evolved to avoid danger, for example, the caveman chasing the tiger, and we have adapted to cope with this stress. So this is useful when there's real danger, but the problem is that it can't tell the difference between general worries, which can trigger the brain to think there's an immediate threat, which can then result in too much cortisol, the stress hormone, and not enough of the feel-good hormones like oxytocin or dopamine. But the positive is that there are lots of things we can do to calm and reset our system and to help ourselves and our children, many which I'm sure you may be doing already. Okay. So how can we help children to feel less worried and regulate their emotions? Well, I'd say the first thing is to look after yourself first, which I think is incredibly difficult for many of us at the moment. You've probably heard of the saying, put your oxygen mask on first, but I think that's really, really important, depending on your circumstances. But I think it's about thinking, if you're able to think about what you could do each day, just something small, even if it's small things, so that you can actually feel okay. A couple of small things, because I think if you feel okay, then your children are more likely to feel contained as well. And the second one I put there is be kind to yourself, you're good enough. I think there are many challenges at the moment and many stresses. And I think one of the key ones, particularly that I've experienced as well, is the challenge of homeschooling, parenting. At the end, watch well. I have the tips for that on the next slide. And then I've added a couple of emotions, responses, as much as you're able to, will help children to contain theirs. And I think, again, it's very difficult to always do that, because sometimes we're stressed and we can't do that. But I think it's just having that and being aware of that will help our children if we're able to contain our emotions as much as we're able to. And finally, being aware of your actions and response. So, for example, just be conscious that if you are talking a lot about them, that it may increase their anxiety. On to the next slide, thanks. So a little bit more about anxiety, and then I'll talk about some tips. So anxiety is essentially processed through the senses. It's encoded in the sensory world. So through sounds, smells, pictures, images, sensations, and that's partly why it's effective to use our senses to calm our body. In the context of a cognitive behavioral model, which some of you may be familiar with, the CBT model, which links thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And the thoughts part in this model are typically thinking that something bad is about to happen, or ruminating on the past, which will lead to then feelings of anxiety. So that could be sort of a fast heartbeat or feeling sweaty or whatever it is. And often in the anxiety model, it leads to avoidant behavior. Working on this, it's very much about addressing the thoughts, feelings, and behavior to stop the maintenance cycle somehow. And with older children, it's often more effective to work on the thoughts and feelings, whereas with children maybe perhaps under about 12, it's often thought that it's better to focus more on the behaviors. Not that you wouldn't be thinking about the thoughts, but if you're focusing on the behaviors with younger children, that in effect will change their thoughts. So I've put the snowball effect. I think if you're talking to your children, sometimes it's helpful to get them to think about this, but actually it's just that to get them to think about one negative thought can easily lead to a number of others, and it's hard to stop. So in the same way the ball is rolling down the hill. So it's one negative thought is very powerful in triggering many, many other negative thoughts. And I've also I've put thought traps here. So I thought that was quite, in terms of if you are talking to children a bit older as well, they might understand this. But that we've all got thought traps. So an example of these might be black and white thinking, or that something small might have happened, but then your conclusion is, I'm terrible at this. Or catastrophizing, again, something minor happened, and then you feel my life is ruined. Or emotional reasoning, I feel bad, so it must be true. And I think thought traps are more obvious when we're stressed, emotional, and tired. And actually, sometimes it's helpful to remind young people that this is what's going on for them at that moment. And finally, that actually anger can sometimes mask anxiety. And if we go on to, thanks, Haringey. We've got the anger iceberg, which, sorry, it's a little bit blurred there, but some of you may be familiar with it, but I hope you'll be able to see the anger. Actually, it's masking a lot of different emotions. It might be shame, sadness, embarrassment, feeling grumpy, guilt, whatever it is, anxiety. And that's not always the case, but often behind anger are a lot of different emotions. And I think that anger actually with our children is a much more difficult emotion to deal with than sadness. And sometimes it is also worth reflecting on what your child's emotions awaken in you and what triggers these. So on to the next slide. Thanks. So some top tips. So I put here, talk, not necessarily fix it, wonder and notice. And I thought this is really important because I think as parents, we often feel that we do want to fix it and make it okay, and that we have to fix it. But actually, sometimes all our children want is for us to acknowledge how they're feeling and to be present with them. And sometimes wonder and notice. And what I mean by that is wondering out loud. I'm wondering if you're feeling sometimes is a non-invasive way of kind of saying it's a helpful way of addressing things with children. And also, I guess, noticing positive behavior is another way to help them feel secure and feel positive about themselves. And then I put sometimes just listen, sometimes look at evidence for and against thoughts and weigh up like. So what I mean by that is, again, older children possibly, looking at the evidence, getting them to pretend that they're in court like a judge, and you've got evidence for and evidence against. And sometimes if you're feeling particularly upset, it's very easy to discount certain evidence. And actually getting a child to write down the evidence makes it more balanced in their minds. And I've put here thoughts, not facts. And I think that's actually a really useful one as well. I think it's when children, again, are feeling very emotional or upset, they feel that the thoughts in their head are actually true and they're fact. And often they're not. And I think it's reminding children of that can be quite powerful in challenging them. And it's sometimes also talking to them about, actually, this is just the same story. So it might be that keep on coming back, like I can't do it. You could label it as the I can't do it story. Is sometimes useful for them as well, to start noticing where they're having certain patterns of thoughts as well. So what else could help manage and worry? Oh, sorry, just to go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So what else could help manage worries? Well, a gratitude journal is also a useful thing that you could do yourself as a parent or with your children, and in terms of helping us to feel good about ourselves at the end of the day, been really stressful. And it's about really writing down or saying at the end of the day 3 things you appreciate for the day, 3 things that you feel have gone well, or 3 things that you think you did well. And actually, again, it's another strategy to help rebalance how we're feeling, especially if we're feeling very negatively about things. And if your child is feeling particularly anxious, getting them to write down worries throughout the day can be a useful tool, or having a specific worry time that you set with them at the end of the day, but not too bedtime. So they know 6 p.m. for 15 minutes, they can have a chat with you and talk through their worries. Can be a really useful thing for some children. Okay. And then we come on to mindfulness. So I put here the power of connecting the body with the breathing. So the science behind mindfulness is that essentially it's linking back to the previous slide I was talking about, the brain and body. And the evidence shows that it actually increases dopamine and oxytocin, which is the feel-good hormone, and it reduces cortisol, the stress hormone. It also activates the vagal nerve, which I mentioned before, and calms the nervous system down. So there's lots of scientific evidence that it works not only with adults, but also with children. And you may or may not be very familiar with mindfulness, but essentially it's about being in the present moment in a non-judgmental way. And often it's about being out of the mind, into the body and the sensory around. And I think I'm working with children using mindfulness. I often try and explain it to them as actually it's about having a choice of where your attention is, and the more you practice, the better you are at putting your attention where you want it to be. Okay, so I put some examples here. I could do a whole presentation on mindfulness, but I've just chosen a couple of examples. And actually, we've got lots of other information on our EPS website, which I'll reference at the end if you would like some more information on that. But just a couple of short mindfulness activities. So stop, pause, breathe is just one you can use with your children. If you're finding it's really stressful with them, they're having a tantrum and everything's going wrong, it's just saying to yourself, stop, pause, and just breathe for 5 breaths to try and contain your own emotions. If you can try and do that, it can sometimes be a really useful tool. The other one that actually some children really like is holding up 5 fingers Asking how anxious they are feeling at the moment out of 5. Say it's a 4 out of 5. And then asking them 3 things they can hear, 3 things they can see, and 3 things they can smell or feel. And once they've done that, asking them to hold their 5 fingers up again and asking them how anxious they feel now. And actually children really like that one sometimes because it's like a mini experiment, and they can see actually that often they tend to feel less anxious because they've taken themselves out of their mind and into the senses in their body. Another one is visualizing a flower. So holding your hand out and getting them to close their eyes and getting them to imagine a flower's opening and closing according to their breathing in and out. And some children really like that one. The other one that I think actually is quite simple but really powerful is putting your hand on your heart and sometimes on your stomach as well. And just asking children to do that can actually be really powerful. There's actually evidence that it soothes the vagus nerve. And this is really useful, I think, if a child is feeling particularly anxious. Just even doing that can actually really calm the system. Okay. I'm nearly at the end, so I'm going to be like literally a couple of minutes. I think my time's nearly come up. So again, oh, sorry, could you just go back for a minute? Thank you. Nearly at the end of my presentation. So rhythmic movement, again, running, walking, breathing is strongly linked to the way we feel, and changing breathing reduces anxiety. And of course, we've got the importance of nature and doing creative activities such as painting, drawing, and baking. With older adults or children, it might be used to go through a process of thinking, is it helpful? What am I making this mean? Pausing and tuning in with your body, doing a mindful activity, and then helping them to reflect. And they'll need help on this, on what would be a more helpful thought, and reframing that for them. And then I've just added on the body scan and the MSPR. Palouse Mindfulness is a really good website. The body scan is helpful in connecting the mind and body. And also younger children making that link between mind and body, maybe even drawing a body and helping them name feelings and where they might feel it in the body is a really useful thing as well. And onto the final slide. Essentially, if you feel connected, your sense of stress reduces and resolves significantly. So I've put quality time together. I know that's difficult at the moment for many people, and if that's not possible, I think just even your presence is so important. Realizing, so holding them in mind and sharing this. I was thinking about you when I wasn't with you. So saying things like that to children can be powerful. And finally, emotion coaching. John Gottman, 1997. Developed this emotion coaching, and it's emotions and empathizing, how powerful this is in building and reducing stress. And Dan Siegel did an experiment. He named emotions, gave people scary or stressful stories with or without naming feelings. And he actually saw changes in the brain when feelings were named. So the evidence shows it's very powerful. So a couple of examples, and I'm going to finish, is I can see you're feeling sad that you can't hug grandma at the moment. I would also feel this. Or I'm wondering if you're feeling worried about that. I would also feel like that. Again, on our EPS website, there's more about that. That's the end of my presentation. I've got some resources at the end that I hope might be relevant for you, which I'm happy to talk through if anyone's got any questions. And I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.